Welcome to No Romance Without Finance. Today we are amongst royalty. Goli Ameri. Goli is one of the highest serving Iranians in the US government. Currently, Goli is the CEO and co-founder of StartItUp, an online SMB Advisory Marketplace connecting businesses with one or more live advisors and strengthening the advisory relationship with a broad range of AI and business tools. Prior to her entrepreneurial experience, Goli was a director at U.S. Leasing responsible for market evaluation and planning for a portfolio of over $200 million in assets and high technology equipment. Goli was a U.S. Assistant Secretary of State responsible for the second largest bureau of the State Department with responsibilities for the bulk of U.S. public diplomacy. She was also the Undersecretary for Humanitarian Diplomacy at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Goli's previous positions include service as a presidentially nominated representative to the 60th session of the United Nations General Assembly and as a public delegate to the 61st session of the United Nations Commissions on Human Rights. Goli received her BA and MA from Stanford University and has studied at the Sorbonne. She is the recipient of the Ellis Island Medal of Honor presented annually to American citizens whose accomplishments in their field and inspired services to the United States are cause for celebration. In this episode, Goli talks about her immigration story and the mom guilt and the challenges of balancing work and motherhood. She also discusses her journey into politics and her passion for human rights, along with dealing with imposter syndrome as a woman and how to push yourself to succeed in spite of it. Welcome, Goli. Hi, Goli. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so excited to have you on because you really are someone that I look up to as a mentor, as someone that I would like to emulate in life. And I think that everything that you've done in your life is going to be so inspirational to the people that listen to this podcast. And, most of our listeners, if not all of them, are women. And I think women are just going to get so much out of your story and how you were able to get to where you are. So I kind of want to start from the beginning. You were born in Iran, correct?
Yes.
Okay, yes, just like me. So when did you move to the United States? How did that come about?
Well, I moved in 1974 to come to the U.S. to go to college. And, maybe some of your listeners may not know this, but at the time, Iran actually had the largest number of foreign students in the United States.
Wow.
And I was one of those foreign students. And, that's what we did. We came to the U.S. to get the best education and then go back to Iran and do something significant for the people and the country, right?
That's amazing. And that's when you were at Stanford?
Yes.
Yeah, that little school, Stanford. That is amazing. And then, so your plan was to go back, and did you go back to Iran?
No, actually, I was part of that cohort that by the time we were even thinking of returning, and of course, I was in the middle of my undergraduate, or at the tail end of it, the revolution happened. So there was really no option of going back.
Okay, so you come to the United States thinking that you're going to get an education, and you got your BA and master's from Stanford, thinking that you're going to go back, and then the revolution happens and it throws a complete monkey wrench in your plans. So then what did you decide to do then? What was plan B?
Right. And, of course, there were, hundreds of thousands of us that were exactly in the same boat. And, at the time, obviously, because of the hostage crisis, the American public, rightly so, was angry, and President Carter was trying to deal with that. And, one of the ways that he felt he could deal with that, instead of unifying people, he basically wanted, all students, to return, every Iranian in the country to return.
Right.
So we were all scrambling to figure out how not to do that because, clearly so many their parents' lives, their own lives were in danger. It was kind of a messy situation in Iran at the time, not to mention the fact that, I think my generation was a very driven generation, men and women both. We were meant to make change. We were made to, do big things, at least in our minds. And,
Right.
this opportunity was taken away. And then, of course, this great country, the United States of America, that welcomes immigrants, ultimately welcomed us. And here we all are. And honestly, sometimes I think to myself, I adore my heritage. I adore my Iranian heritage. But I think when I really think about it, America is such an incredible mindset that I really feel fortunate that I was able to stay here and to be able to really find myself, and I think that's just the best way of saying that.
Right. And so you get out of college and what did you do? What was your first job? How did you begin to establish yourself?
Right. And actually that in itself, parts of it is at least a funny story. It was very difficult to find a job, obviously, in the middle of the hostage crisis.
Hmm.
But at the same time, once again, that American spirit of kindness and helping out and giving people, second chances and opportunities was really at work. But I do remember, coming out and, one of the job interviews I had, I mean, we were ready and willing to take any job. And this was a job at an insurance company where people were asking me how many words per minute did I type. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, this was not supposed to be my destiny in life.
I have a master's from Stanford.
And then,
Right?
this older gentleman said to me, people of your kind are hard workers. So
Oh my
we'd like to
gosh.
give opportunities to that. Anyway, I did not get that job,
Wow.
by the way, but
Thank God.
but I did get a job at Burroughs Corporation, which was a major computer vendor at the time. And, I had 8 interviews there, and they were, clearly worried about their clients and how they felt about working with someone of Iranian heritage. But, my goodness, that branch manager of Burroughs who gave me that job, I am grateful to him for the rest of my life. I learned a lot in that job.
Wow. Okay. So then how did your career progress to the point where you started in government? Tell us about the trajectory.
Right. And actually, Patty, I think this is a good story for women. Um, and maybe I will kind of conclude with that. But, I sort of climbed the corporate ladder to a certain extent. And then, I my last job was a director at US Leasing. And,
Mhm.
I think at that time, I must have had my second child, and then I came down
Mhm.
with breast cancer. And this was, kind of at a younger
Oh
age.
no.
And so, I was sort of in and out for a year dealing with that. And then I decided to kind of work part time.
Mhm.
And then I started a small consulting, kind of a boutique consulting firm to do, consulting in the telecom world at the time, which was just being deregulated. And, this sort of gave me an opportunity to keep working, but at the same time, be there for my children, which is an issue that pretty
Right.
much every mother that I know of out there, deals with
Yes,
at some point in their
absolutely.
career, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And how challenging was that? And was that something that you always thought that you were going to do is work as a woman and have children? Or did you think, "Oh, when I have children, I don't want to work?" Or how did that come about in your head?
Right. And that's a great question. And remember, in my generation, um, it wasn't as evident and obvious and acceptable as it is today. Today it's
Sure.
like women are not judging each other. Some women want to work. A lot of women want to work. Some women necessarily may not want to work. Childcare is obviously always an issue. That it was an
Right.
issue then, it's an
Mhm.
issue now. For me, it
Sure.
was really always important to be connected to the working world. But, it's challenging. It even, when you start your own thing, you're kind of always feeling like, well, I'm not achieving as much as I want to achieve, because my consulting thing
Mhm.
was small. It wasn't like, anything significant. But to make it
Right.
significant, you really had to invest a lot of time. But then at the same time, you don't want to take time away from your kids. And I think this is a decision that a lot of women have faced and are facing and will continue to face. It's normal. It's
Correct.
just in our genes. And I think we need to be comfortable with that.
Mhm.
It's a challenge. I think we have to accept the fact that it's a challenge and just do our best and be the best moms that we can be, while at the same time, if we want, keeping our ties to the working world and not judge each other. I think that's really critical, which I honestly don't think is happening as much these days as it was at that time when I was younger.
Yes, you're right. It's a lot more accepted now that, that women are working. But even today, I see mom guilt so much with my friends, with my family. I have a friend who has a very, very successful consulting firm. I mean, she has more business than she knows what to do with, right? And she doesn't get to spend a lot of time with her son. And I mean, I think she's actually very balanced, but as much time, I guess, as she wants to spend with her son. So she has mom guilt. And in order to make up for it, when he finished kindergarten, she had this like huge graduation for kindergarten for him. I mean, like, with congratulations, graduate on the lawn. You would think this kid graduated from Harvard. I kid you not. He graduated from kindergarten. But when I was speaking with her about it, I said, how much of this has to do with the fact that you feel guilty because you're not around as much as you'd like? And she said, most of it. And
Yeah.
we still, as women, carry a lot of that guilt that we need to be the, and this child is very, very much loved, very well rounded. There's nothing wrong with this child, thank goodness. But we just feel that. And I know that back then in your generation, it was even worse that you had to make that decision.
Yeah, exactly. And honestly, the older I've gotten and hopefully a bit wiser, I've just come to the conclusion that, we have to be comfortable with that guilt. There's nothing wrong with that guilt.
Yes.
I think that guilt is a sentiment that propels us
Yes.
forward, that helps us make decisions. And I think it's part and parcel of the deal. And, by God, I'm not a child expert by any means, but what I'm seeing in my own kids at least is that, and I have two boys, I don't have daughters, but I see with my
Hmm.
boys that they are proud and comfortable of their mom. I think that sort of means
Yes.
something to them, and I think at the same time, it's all about how much love you give to your children and how you're always there for them
Absolutely.
when they need you. So it's not like you need to hover. And honestly, my generation hovered too much. We helicopter too much. And I
Hmm.
think a lot of
Hmm.
us are realizing that. And, maybe part of the hovering helicoptering had to do with the guilt, but that probably is not the
Correct.
best way to do it either.
Right. No, absolutely. And the fact that your children saw you working and saw you being successful, I am certain that opened their eyes and their perception on the type of woman that they want to be with, right?
Right.
That and they're more open to being with a woman that is successful, that has her own business. Like for example, my mother, when she was in Iran, she was very, very successful. Unfortunately, when we came to the US, because of the language barrier, she could no longer work in her field. But when she was in Iran, she was very successful. And I saw that, and she instilled that in me, and my brother saw that. So now, my brother marries a woman who has her own business, super successful, super smart. She chose to keep her maiden name, was never an issue. And it's because he saw role models as women growing up, just like your children did, that didn't really teach him those gender stereotypes. My brother washes dishes. He does the
I
laundry.
love
He
that.
cooks and cleans just like everybody else. But it's women like you that set the standard and set the tone for what's appreciated about women, and not just the typical gender norms that men
Yeah,
expect.
absolutely. I love that. I love this story about your mom. My goodness, at that time to be working like that in Iran, that was a big deal. And really
Right.
kudos to her. What one of the things that actually makes me feel a lot better about the status of women is that, you know, in essence, we are the ones that sort of raised the millennial generation, and the millennials are all having children, and they're all, they're they're getting married, having children. And I see a whole different situation with the way the millennial couples deal with each other. There's a lot more
Mm-hmm.
equality of responsibilities. There's it's a team
Yes.
spirit. It's not like, you're
Yes.
pigeonholed in this job and the other one is pigeonholed in the other job. There's a lot of
Correct.
collaboration going on there, which I just think is so refreshing.
Yes, it is. It is the younger generation. There's a lot more collaboration. There's a lot more acceptance of, or I should denial of gender roles, right? And everyone pretty much does everything. And I think again, that's a testament to women like you, women like my mother, even my friends that have raised their sons in situations or their daughters in situations where, hey, your mother goes to work,
Right,
and so your wife is probably going to go to work, and everyone's responsible for it all. And I think one thing that I've seen is that um, the younger generation feels like everyone is really typically responsible for the duties in the home. And when I see my brother doing that, I think that's so important, because a lot of times I remember there was once a guy that one of our neighbors came in to pick up something, and my fiance and I, we have a rule: when he cooks, I clean, and vice versa. So I had cooked and he was cleaning, and the guy comes over and he sees my fiance washing dishes, and he's like, "Wow, you're so lucky to have a man that helps you." And I was like, "Helps me?" I'm like, "I'm sorry, what do you mean by help?" He goes, "Well, yeah, he's cleaning." I said, "Well, by saying help, you're insinuating that this is a task that's assigned to
right,
me that he is doing, right? That he's helping me out because this is my job." I was like, this isn't my job. It is both of our jobs to make sure that our living environment is clean, the dishes are done, and he is helping himself. He's not just helping me. And I think the younger generation is starting to really understand
right,
that. And I think that's something that's really
totally.
refreshing. All right, Goli. So I want to move to something that I really am very interested in knowing. And you are the highest ranking Iranian to ever hold a government position. And I I just want to cry when I say that, because like you're a woman, and like to be able to do that, I think is so amazing. How did you get into government? How did that come
Okay.
about?
Actually, let me back up for a moment. I'm so honored when people say that, but there are three other individuals. Actually, one of them, an incredible woman, a friend who was the U.S. ambassador to Sweden, who unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago,
Oh
and she
no.
was really a phenomenal woman, Azita Raji, Ambassador Azita Raji. And then there was two
Mm,
gentlemen, also of Iranian heritage, that have been assistant secretaries in the Bush and the Obama administrations. So,
okay.
and then, there's currently another person of Iranian heritage that's an ambassador. So clearly, I think we are finally finding our way within, the US political system, which is incredible. So
Sure.
to answer your question, maybe because of what happened in Iran, maybe because of the revolution, maybe because of the fact that when we were growing up in Iran, it was not advised to be politically involved. So, many of us sort of,
Hmm.
just focused on our daily lives and our, everything else, but not on the political side. I was very interested in that. So, I remember at an early time, once I'd found a job and, we had a, decent lifestyle, I started getting involved in, politics, you know, whether I was living in California, when I lived up in Oregon, I started getting involved in,
Hmm.
the political party. At that time, I was a Republican, so I was getting involved in the
Hmm.
Republican committees and, you know, doing a lot of different things there. And I was really, really very, very interested in that. And, because of some of those activities, there was a conversation about potentially running for Congress in Oregon, and you
Hmm.
know, people people were interested in talking to me about it because the current congressman at the time was of um, Taiwanese heritage, so they thought, one immigrant running after, running against another would, it's a good story, and there are possibilities, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So I did. I ran for Congress at the time. God knows I learned a lot. And then since then I've talked to a lot of other members of the community and not members of the Iranian American community about running for Congress, because you learn a lot of
Sure.
lessons when you do that for the first time. And
Mm-hmm.
I won my primary, which was a big deal in the sense that I think it says a lot about the people of Oregon, that they didn't think for a minute about nominating a person of Iranian heritage at the time when, Iran and the U.S.
Right.
clearly have not had a good relationship in a very long time, but particularly at that time. And
Sure.
I think it really says a lot about the American spirit. So I won my Republican primary, but not the general election, although it was a race that
Mm-hmm.
um, gained a lot of attention for two reasons. One is because of the whole immigrant factor for both of us, but two, when you when
Right.
you raise funds, when you're running for office and you raise a good deal of funds, it just gets attention because in many ways, I think it makes you a more credible candidate. So when
Right.
usually, for those people out there who are interested, usually the White House is paying attention to some races that get a lot of traction, because that's how you create a farm team,
Mm-hmm.
right? You and that creating that farm
Ah.
team is really important. So when I lost
Right.
the race, the White House was interested in finding out what I was interested in and what I would be interested in doing, and I think they knew that I was very interested in human rights and freedom, and that's something I've always been interested in because I keep thinking about what
Mm-hmm.
we've gained in this country and people back in so many other countries don't. Anyway,
Yes.
so to make a long story
Yes.
short, I got appointed by the president to be the one of the representatives to the UN Commission on Human Rights, and then subsequently to the UN General Assembly, and then as the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Educational and Cultural Affairs. So that's kind of the track. It's
Gosh.
all about the opportunities, honestly, that this country
Amazing.
offers you.
Absolutely. And how long were you doing that? How long
Um,
were you in
I
government?
think totally it was probably 3.5, 4 years, but some of it not full time. Like, for example, the UN Commission on Human Rights is only for a
Mm-hmm.
few months in Geneva, but over the span of, I would say, about 4 years, probably.
And as a woman and as a female immigrant, did you feel like you faced certain challenges that your male counterparts didn't?
Um, Actually, let me rephrase that question. I don't think I felt any challenges because of my heritage. And in fact, if anything, it was always an advantage. In fact,
Great.
um,
Explain that,
well,
please.
because, I think, once again, I want to keep repeating this, it's like when the US provides this opportunity and you do your job, the way you're supposed to do it, it it creates momentum for everyone. The administration is happy, you're
Mm-hmm.
happy. It's like, something good
Right,
is
right.
happening out of that. Something good is happening when you
Great.
present opportunities to the immigrant communities. But especially when I was in these positions, I think my Iranian heritage, first of all, was very surprising to a lot of people. I think it said a lot about the United
Mm-hmm.
States, but I think I was also able to leverage that, to have, better conversations with people. And I think when I was at the State Department as the Assistant Secretary, I traveled a lot, and I think it was very interesting for people to, you know, to see that and to experience that. Like, just to give you a quick example, I had a visit to France, and one of the things the U.S. Embassy wanted to do was we went on a visit to some of the banlieues, the suburbs in Paris that have a majority North African
Mm-hmm.
population. And you saw what just recently
Mm-hmm.
happened with the uprising in France after one of their members was shot by the police. There's was kind of another Black Lives Matter
Yes.
movement, in France. And I think
Yes.
one of the things that I heard that really has still, just in my heart is they said, I am the first high-ranking government official that has ever visited them. Like the French government had not done
Wow.
that. It just, so experiences like this are, they makes you acutely aware of how important outreach is, how important unifying diversity is. It just,
Hmm.
I still remember that episode.
Yes, yes. And, it's very obvious that you're so passionate about human rights. You have been so vocal about what's been going on in Iran with the women in Iran and the atrocious treatment of the women and taking away of, their just basic human rights in Iran. And we've, you and I have talked about that. We've been on panels about it. And one thing that I want to ask you is, what do you think about the UN allowing Iran to have a seat at the table
Yeah.
um, at the UN convention? I mean, how does that even work? And how is that even possible?
The United Nations was set up on very solid principles and desires and aspirations. And, obviously it was to bring people together and to make sure that, the rights of people are protected and everything else that the UN does for
Hmm.
people. Unfortunately, I think what has happened at the UN is that the UN represents governments more than it represents the people of a nation. And that's sort of the best way that I can
Wow.
summarize it. And there's a lot of politics going on at the
Yeah.
UN. Like, I remember when I was there and lobbying as a member of the US delegation, lobbying countries to vote on the human rights record on Iran, many countries declined because of all the trade agreements they have for Iran on, every way that they have a tie to Iran that they cannot jeopardize. There is a lot of that going on, unfortunately, when it comes to, and
Hmm.
it's not just Iran,
Yeah.
many other countries, but clearly the situation with Iran is so
Yes.
egregious right now that the politics of the UN
Hmm.
gets in the way.
Yes, and it's so disappointing because I'm like, you are all about human rights. That's what it is about. And the human rights of, yeah, you're right. It's not just Iran. There are other countries definitely there's atrocities about human rights taking place every single day. And I just feel like the UN does nothing to punish these countries and just welcomes them with open arms. So I don't know what the solution is, but I think that if they're going to be talking about human rights, and I don't want to get too political on the podcast, but if they're going to be talking about human rights, then if they're going to
Yeah,
walk the walk, they need to
exactly.
talk the talk, and that's
Exactly.
not what they're doing right now. So yeah, so I want to get into when you know transitioned and when you were working and had your own company, and this podcast is called No Romance Without Finance, and you decided to get married and have children. Did you think about financial independence and your financial independence and whether that was important
Um,
for you as a woman?
I think it was important, but I think it was also a kind of a slow growing up and learning process. I think yeah, I mean, like I see with the
Okay,
millennial
explain.
women that, that is really important for them. And this, one of the reasons why many of them are sort of
Hmm.
putting child rearing, putting it off sort of for the future. A lot of women are getting married later, having children later.
Right.
And I think a lot of that has to do with financial independence.
Sure.
I think in my case, I mean, I honestly, I love talking about this because the learning process was gradual. It was important, and that's why I like to say it, because I think hopefully
Hmm.
other people will hear it and think that, you know no decision has to be, kind of a whiz bang decision right there. Sometimes it's evolutionary, right? So,
Sure.
clearly when I was
Sure.
married and we were settled, it was really important for me to work. That was, my number one priority, and not to mention the fact that it was necessary. I mean, it was very difficult for us to, have a
Hmm.
decent lifestyle without one income. but obviously as time went on,
Sure.
and for a while my former husband was trying to figure out how to set up his own business, and he was very entrepreneurial, and so he quit his job to sort of work on some of the logistics of what he was doing. So for a while I was supporting both of us, which was wonderful. It was a great feeling. But
Hmm.
then, as his business grew,
Right.
obviously, our financial situation changed. And it was mostly because of,
Sure.
his entrepreneurial spirit. But, the two of us were clearly together and working together.
Of
So,
course.
I think I thought about financial independence at that time. And I think it was kind of always like a kind of a little needle that pricked me every now and then. But at the same time, life was moving
Hmm.
on. Kids were being born. Expenses were there.
Hmm.
So you sort of in a way
Yeah.
kind of get used to that. And did it bother me? I would say probably bothered me to a certain extent that I was not as financially independent as I wanted to be. But then at the same time, there's another voice in your head that says, well,
Hmm.
you're a couple, you're together. Why do you always mess around in your
Right.
brain with these thoughts that are unnecessary? You know how those things go. Um,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. Yeah. But you were working, you were
yes,
contributing
I was. But
financially to the
honestly,
relationship, right?
the comparative
Yeah.
percentage was in the other, court and camp, and I think that
Sure.
needs to be admired and celebrated. But I really did
Of
think about
course.
that. um, but ultimately, once the kids grew, and I went into government, and subsequently I worked with the Red Cross, so I kind of got back into my in my career thing, so
Right.
which was obviously very fulfilling. Because, and maybe I'll leave it at that, and you can ask me about it. I kind of want to talk a little bit about, I did have a mini midlife crisis in my early 40s. So yeah, I think, because I think it's
Let's talk
important for
about it.
women
Okay. Yeah.
to hear that. This was at a
Sure.
time when you know, like I had my small consulting firm, projects, I was busy. It wasn't like I was making a ton of money. And it was
Hmm.
difficult because I was raising my kids and all of that. And I remember sitting in a bar with my sister-in-law when I was like 40 or 41 or something like that, and saying, gosh, I was meant to do more in my life. Like, I love the fact that I've raised my kids and they're amazing and
Wow.
I adore them, but it sort of doesn't seem enough. And I didn't know what the next step was. And I think in the middle of this whole congressional thing came up, and and the rest of it is history. But honestly, for a couple of years there, I was sort of really banging my head against the wall trying to figure out what my next step is. And then, with all those feelings comes the fact that you have a little bit of an imposter syndrome. And then you and I have talked about this before.
Hmm.
Women think that the sun and the moon and the stars all have to align before you take that next step. In many ways, in
Yep.
our minds, we're perfectionists.
Yes.
We sort
Yes.
of we analyze risk differently. We maybe we don't feel as good about ourselves or as confident as we should. I don't know really what the deal is, but all I know is that what I've learned is that
Right.
essentially, and maybe even scientifically, the sun and the moon and the stars do not line up
Hmm.
ever. And we just have to accept
Yep.
that and say, I may have an imposter
Yes.
syndrome. I am going to take that next step. And the worst that can happen is it doesn't work out. I didn't win my race, but a lot of other great things happened after that. So yeah.
Exactly. Yes. Yes, and I love that you say that, because we women are really afraid of rejection, and I think that's because we've been inculcated not to take risks as children. That men have been told, and I've said this in other podcasts, like, climb a tree. If you fall, it's okay. You just wipe yourself off. Keep going. But we women have been protected, right? No, don't fall. Don't do this. Don't do that. So we're very risk adverse, and we're afraid to fail. So unless everything aligns, everything is perfect, we're afraid to take that next step. And that next step is where the magic is at, right? Even if you
Exactly.
fail, just like you were saying, yeah, you didn't, you didn't win the ultimate race, but so what? So much came out of that. There have been so many failures that I've had where, I didn't get the job, but guess what? Someone saw me and they were like, you
Exactly.
would be good for this position. And it was even a better position than the other one that I
Totally.
wanted in the beginning, right? But yeah, and you and I have talked about this, is that you went from, you transitioned from tech to government to nonprofit to back to tech, and you just took so many steps, and it's not easy. And we do it even though
Exactly.
we're afraid,
Well,
right?
and
I'm sure it
I
wasn't
also want
easy
to
for
add
you.
this is that, half the time, I'm going to say this again, you kind of you feel like you have an imposter syndrome. That you feel like, oh, well, I'm not as
Yes,
perfect as I need to
yes,
be. It's like I'm not, you just kind of don't feel like you're real. But I think that is something that we need to learn how to control. But to answer your question, I think one of the things I've finally figured out in my own head is that I've made these changes because, and I'm not sure whether that's the best decision. I think that's up to, women for themselves to figure
hmm
that out. But I get
right,
I get I can't say I get bored, but it's like I like drinking from the fire hose. I think that's one thing I've learned about myself. And I've been in all of these jobs where I
yes,
literally knew nothing about,
yes,
and I had to spend a lot of time learning and studying
yep,
and getting up to speed, and then relying on the team, in
yep,
order to make it happen and to make it succeed. So that's one reason. I think the drawback of that, which I would like to highlight for people, is that our network is one of the most important things that we can develop in life, Patty. And I think you and I have talked about this as well.
hmm
The
yep,
network around you, the people
yep,
the people that you can learn from, these all really add a tremendous amount of value to our lives. And I think one of the problems with moving from one area to another is that essentially your network is not as large in that particular domain as you want it to be. So I think, that's something for
correct,
women to think about.
correct. Correct, correct.
Exactly.
But guess what? You're
Exactly.
building new networks, right? You're building new networks. So even though, for example, I don't practice law anymore, there have been times where I've needed my legal network still. So yeah, I don't practice law, but you're building new networks, and it's always a benefit. Anytime you grow, anytime you do something new, anytime you do something different, it's always going to be advantageous. And I have never ever, Goli June, been qualified for any job anyone's ever given me. Honestly, never. I have just pretended that I knew what I was doing, because that's what the men do. The men aren't qualified either, trust me. I have just I've just pretended I knew what I was doing. I knew that I could figure it out. I had confidence enough in myself to figure it out. And again, I did have imposter syndrome, but I was like, I'm going to do it anyway. I figured it out, and I killed the game. So women, just learn everything that Goli just told you about, just doing it anyway, just going for it, not being afraid, and it will lead you to success. Goli, thank you so much for joining us. It was such a pleasure to have you today. You were really an inspiration to all of us, and you've done so much in your life. And we're really
Thank you,
honored
Patty.
that
Thank you
you
so
took
much for
time to
having
be
me.
with us
Honestly,
today.
this was a great learning experience for me as well. And it's always such a pleasure to speak with you. And I just love how bold you are in terms of, talking about these ideas, which is important, because if we're not bold, we can't make change.
Yes. Absolutely, absolutely. And listeners, thank you so much for listening. As always, please make sure to subscribe and rate the podcast. That is what keeps us going. And until next time, never forget that a man is not a financial plan.